Welcome to Sawtooth Software's webinar, Unlocking the Potential of MaxDiff. My name is Christina Miller, and I am the manager of our client services team here in the USA. Our presenters are Brian McEwen and Dean Tyndall. Brian McEwen joined Sawtooth Software in 2008 and has been heavily involved in introducing marketing scientists to joys of conjoint analysis for the past 14 years. From helping with technical support and new customer onboarding to leading a range of choice modeling workshops, Brian is heavily involved in everything we do here at Sawtooth Software. Brian is currently leading the charge in the setup of our European office, helping to ensure that we can better serve our customers around the world. Previous to joining Sawtooth Software, Dean has been a marketing scientist for the past 13 years, building up a toolkit of techniques such as drivers analysis, segmentation, MaxDiff, and conjoint analysis. He put these skills to use, helping to drive strategic decision-making for multinational clients, such as Amazon, Walgreens, Walmart, and Liberty Global. Here at Sawtooth Software, Dean is involved in both the support and consulting areas of the business, helping users to get the most out of Sawtooth Software's products and helping clients make better decisions. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Christina. As Christina mentioned, we are talking about MaxDiff today. We're going to do just a brief introduction just to make sure we're all on the same page, since we might have different people from different backgrounds. So just to start off, maximum difference scaling, or MaxDiff, sometimes also called best worst scaling, is an approach that we at Sawtooth really like, and a lot of other people like it too, as a replacement for situations where you might normally use something like a rating scale or a rank order question. So the typical approach is that we might have a list of items that we're interested in understanding people's preferences for, and we break that down into smaller bite-sized questions. A lot of times we use the word task, where the respondent will see maybe 4 or 5 of those and indicate which of those subsets is the most desirable or least desirable or best worst. And so it's quite easy for us to put these exercises together. If we've saw that many of those joining us today are Sawtooth Software users. And so you might be familiar with how easy it is. Generally speaking, we have a screenshot here of our update to our online platform we call Discover. Essentially, you put some question text in, you paste in a list of items. In this case, we have ice cream flavors, and the software will automatically generate a nice, balanced, uncorrelated set of questions for respondents to go through and answer all of these tasks. Now, MaxDiff has a ton of different use cases, whether you're trying to figure out how important things are to your consumers, maybe like the ice cream flavors, you're looking to try to understand what SKUs to put in the store, which variations of a product might be most appealing to your customers. If you're doing marketing, you might want to test a wide variety of messages to try to understand what resonates or has the most impact to respondents. Or if you're a product manager, you might be trying to figure out what do we spend our next few sprints on in our software development plan to prioritize those products that have the greatest appeal to people. So there's lots of usage, lots of use cases, whether you're in a marketing or product management or marketing sciences position. Now, I mentioned that we really like MaxDiff. There's lots of benefits to it. One of the biggest ones is it eliminates any form of scale use bias. So because the respondent is going to make choices of bests and worsts, we're not having to explain a 1 to 5 scale or a 1 to 9 or 10 scale. We don't need to worry about necessarily interpreting what a 4.2 out of 5 average score means. So we really like the fact that we're not using scales here. The questionnaire itself forces differentiation or discrimination among the answers because people are not allowed to tie. They have to choose one of those options that's best and one of those options that's worst. on the page. So it generally provides better differentiation than you would get from something like rating scales. Like we mentioned on the previous slide, widely applicable, regardless of the measurement criteria, importance, appeal, likelihood to purchase, things like that. Very, very widely applicable for us. If you missed our last webinar that we did, you can go back and check out how you can use MaxDiff to identify people who are answering randomly, who are just clicking on those best and worst answers and don't have any pattern or consistency to their answers. That's a really fun tool. And it is really great for segmentation analysis, again, because it's forcing differentiation on people's answers. And then it can be used in turf analysis for creating bundles, total unduplicated reach and frequency. And we'll talk, especially one of our methods today is especially good at doing that. And just as an example here, here's a set of scores you might see based on someone who, the light green scores would be answers to a 5-point rating scale. The darker blue scores are typically what you would expect with a MaxDiff, where things can really get pushed down to the bottom. We get lumpier data. So things can tie if different respondents choose their best and worst appropriately. But you often see this greater differentiation among the scores. That's really nice. Okay. Now we know MaxDiff is not a perfect tool. Because of the requirements, oftentimes there are some limitations. Typically, you're going to deal with maybe about 30 items or less. Any more than that, and you start to just get a really long exercise that probably exceeds what we want most people to go through. Most of the time, we're going to show like 4 or 5 items on the page. We're trying to balance out the amount of stuff they're reading and how difficult the questions are. Our general approach with a traditional MaxDiff is to focus on statistical efficiency. So we're going to typically try to show each item 3 times to the respondent across all of their questions. And we're going to build those questions so that every item shows an equal number of times. And we're also paying attention to the correlation to make sure that each item is shown against every other item. And then we're also going to focus on the position on the page to make sure that we show things in each row an equal number of times. So these principles are really good, but they can sometimes hinder us if our experiments and our designs start to get more complicated. And we're in a traditional MaxDiff, we're going to be showing all of the items to all of the respondents every single time. Now, there's certain situations, and that's kind of our main topic for today, is to address what happens when things get kind of messy, when we don't fit into the traditional parameters of a MaxDiff experiment. So for example, you might say, well, MaxDiff is great at relative preferences, but how do I know in an absolute sense how appealing are these options? Would they actually buy it, for example? You might also have a situation where not all the items are relevant. If you're a product manager for some software, you might have different use cases if someone is in HR versus accounting. Some of those features might be common to them, but others are very specific. You might not want to show and ask people about things that they don't have any experience with or aren't applicable to them. Maybe your list is just really big. Maybe there's lots of different ice cream flavors that you have that you could possibly manufacture. And your survey is already kind of large and you want to know if you can trim things down. So both of those situations, length and just overall number of items. So all of these things are typical approaches. Once you kind of start getting into MaxDiff work, very soon you'll probably hit one of these situations where things are a little more complicated. So we're going to talk about the solutions that we offer here to deal with these particular situations. That's a roadmap for today. So I'm going to take the first one here. How do I know which items are actually appealing to consumers? So we mentioned MaxDiff is great at relative scaling. We're going to show several options on a page. We're going to ask for a best and a worst. And then we're going to do some cool math, run our regressions, and come up with scores that indicate the relative desirability. And so that's great if we're asking about something like importance, but maybe we're trying to get a little more anchored to something, a little more consistent of, does it actually move the needle for purchase or usage or recommendations or something like that? So this is a common problem with MaxDiff. We've got a visual example here of two respondents. In theory, the respondents could answer the questions the same, even though in an absolute magnitude sense, they might be in very different places. For example, maybe we're asking about different steaks and cuts of meat at a restaurant. And I'm a vegetarian, so I can still tell you that a ribeye would be my top choice. But in the grand scheme of things, I'm down at the bottom where none of them are really all that appealing, whereas someone else might choose to eat steak regularly. And so in an absolute sense, we're very different, even though our relative preferences are the same. So we're trying to figure out, is there a way that we can bring in some absoluteness to this? So the general solution for this is to add something that is consistent across all respondents. Now, one way to do this is to not do anything fancy. You could just add one of your MaxDiff items that kind of has a consistent value. For example, a free month or 6 months to Netflix or Disney Plus or something like that. In a particular country, that's going to have a similar value, at least a cost to your respondents. And so that would get you that item, that extra item that we would put in so that we know all these items are less valuable than a month or a 6-month subscription, or all these items are more valuable. But if we don't have an item and we just have the general idea of a threshold, like, would you actually buy this? And we can actually ask those questions of our respondents either directly or indirectly to try to figure out, where do they land? Where do we draw the line in the sand? Where's the threshold for whatever that question is? Now, the most common way that we see users doing this is through an approach called direct anchored. The general approach is that we are going to ask some other question in our survey. This could be a multi-select question where we say, hey, here's all 20 ice cream flavors. Which would you actually buy? We might do rating scales and take a top 2 box type thing. We might give someone an allocation style question. So it's less important about what the question is, but what we're going to do is apply some logic so that we can turn it into like a true false statement, like a Boolean type thing. So we would say something would be purchased if it's a 4 or 5 on my scale, or if they check the box, or if they allocate any points to it. So it can be any question, absolutely, that you can think of, so long as we can turn it into that above the anchor, below the anchor type question. So just a kind of a visual example. I'm a really visual person, so I like to make pictures that help me understand things. So assume we had our MaxDiff. It's got a list of items. The respondent would go through these questions and do all the relative choices of the best and worst, or most important, least important. That's going to give us some idea of the relative preference of the items, so we can place them in order. Then we'll ask, for example, a follow-up question like this that says, all right, which of these are actually important, or which of these would you actually purchase? So the respondent can indicate, in this case on a little 2-point scale here. And then because they've said A, B, D, and E are all in an absolute sense important, then we know where to draw the line for this respondent. We know where that threshold is, and we can estimate it relative to all the other items. So we're really fusing the relative data from our MaxDiff with this anchored question in order to scale things and draw the line in the sand for our respondents. Some of you might have been keeping up on our development for our online platform Discover. We actually have this question automatically built in now, where we do a fun little trick where if your item list is large, we automatically try to build this question for you so that we have good items from the middle, and items that we think are bad for the respondent. From the relative MaxDiff questions, we automatically build this with a subset, maybe choosing every other item or every third item, so that this anchor question doesn't become too overwhelming for people. If you're a Lighthouse Studio user, you can use constructed lists, and you could build the same type of question, either showing all the items or just a subset. as well. Also in Lighthouse Studio, we have what's called indirect anchoring. So instead of asking a separate question, there's a setting in the exercise. You just check a box and you say, I want to do indirect anchoring. And that's going to add a question below the MaxDiff question with 3 possible answers, with the idea being the person says, all of these are above whatever my anchor is, some of them or none of them. So in this particular situation, this respondent has said chocolate is the most desirable, bubblegum is the least desirable. And then by saying I would buy some of these, we know that chocolate is above the anchor, bubblegum is below the anchor, and we don't know about coconut and vanilla. If they said all, then all the items would be above the anchor. If they said none, then all would be below the anchor. So same idea, same data processing and fusing things together, just a slightly different way of answering that question. Hey. So what does this look like when you're done? Well, a traditional set of MaxDiff scores, the scores are rescaled so they sum to 100. They give us the rank order, they give us a measure of distance, and life is great. When we add that anchor, what we do is we try to put that anchor at a consistent point for every respondent. So this is an example where we set that anchor to 100. So we still get that differentiation, we still get rank order, we still get distance, but now we have a line drawn in the sand for all respondents that tells us on average were these items above the anchor or below the anchor. So this gives us some additional fun data to use. It allows you to present things like the top 3 that definitely, in an absolute sense, people would buy or purchase or try. It helps you deliver that anchoring absolute answer of which items are good or bad, not just the relative information that's coming from a traditional MaxDiff. Now that the anchoring data, especially if we ask the direct question, this is also going to give us a great data set to directly run our turf analysis. So if we're trying to figure out what 3 ice cream flavors would reach the greatest number of our respondents, we can do that with the anchored data. If you're a Sawtooth software user, we have turf analysis built in on our online tool, app.sawtoothsoftware.com. So you can upload the anchored data. You can also upload any other data if you want to run turf over there. We've got a separate webinar that on our website that goes over that if you're interested. Okay, so that is anchored MaxDiff. I'm going to turn it over and Dee's going to talk about the next few fancy approaches.
Thank you, Brian. Hi guys, the first one I'm going to talk about is the problem where we have not every item in my list is relevant to all my respondents. And this is something we come across all the time. And quite often you think you might have to get around that situation by having 2 MaxDiffs, or you might just exclude some items because they're not relevant to everyone. But actually within Sawtooth, we have a solution to that. And the solution to that is relevant item MaxDiff, surprisingly enough. Now, relevant item MaxDiff is necessary when you're interested in respondents giving views on items which are only applicable to them. And that is because situations where some respondents don't have access to certain features, some claims might only be relevant to households with children, so you don't want to ask people without children those items because you already know the answer to it. Or it could be a situation where respondents have already informed you that they're not going to consider any features in your list, and you can therefore strip them out straight away because you don't want to capture data that is just unnecessary and redundant. And the way this works is that a list is constructed for respondents based on previously collected information in the questionnaire. So it could be you work in a particular department, so you only want to see some items. You have children, so you get to see these items, things such as that. And the way it works is that the study will generate a design on the fly for them. And what this on-the-fly design means is that you can have different sized lists for each respondent, meaning that we can have completely tailored lists for everyone, and we get away from that problem of the traditional MaxDiff being fairly rigid. So just an example here where we have a B2B study where we have 50 items in our list. So it's a pretty big one. But we have 5 core business areas that relate to these items. What you can do with relevant item MaxDiff is set up a constructed list with 50 items in total, and then drive your list for the MaxDiff from this question here. So for example, if this respondent said they were ultimately the firm's accountant, so they're in charge of accounts payables and accounts receivables, we would then only show them the first 20 items in the list, and we wouldn't show them the next 30 items in the list. Similarly, if someone was in IT, they'd only see 10 items in the list and so forth. So what this means is we can have big lists that are irrelevant to some people, but we can show them only the items they are interested in. And interestingly, one of the cool things about relevant item MaxDiff is the way we can treat the data that isn't seen. So because every respondent doesn't see every item, we can inform the model how to treat the items which were left out. One of the ways we can treat it is by saying that all of the drop levels are unavailable. So we assign a highly negative utility to those, and that just means they're never chosen in any of the analysis we see. We can say that drop levels are inferior, but we still want to get a good score for them. What's going to happen here is that all of the items are going to be ranked below the seen items, but then we're going to borrow some information from other people to know what the relative rank of those should be. And finally, you can say that drop levels are missing at random. And this will just use information from other respondents to fill in the gaps, but assumes that any items were not dropped in on purpose. And this means that you've just got a lot of flexibility with how you drive that constructed list and how you make those relative items for people. And ultimately, we still get scores for all of the items, even though respondents might not have seen them, which is a great outcome. And the benefits of relevant item MaxDiff is it enables a single list to be used across multiple subgroups where every item might not be relevant. I've said that a few times. These customers might not have a particular product in the list, so you don't want to show them. Only businesses might have access to certain services in your list, or you might just want to focus on things that you know they're not interested in. Another benefit is that this allows us to reduce the median size of the MaxDiff exercise. So before we had that 50 item list, but we're actually only getting people to rate about 20 on average. So we don't have to have an insane sized length task for everyone. And finally, it just makes sure that all of the items are of interest to people. So we know that when people are more engaged in questionnaires, they give better answers. And if we've got half the items in there that people just don't care about, then they're probably going to switch off in the exercise, and we know that that's not great for data quality. The next situation we have is one that I used to run into regularly. MaxDiffs are long. We know that, we're aware of that, and then can take up quite a lot of questionnaire time that costs money. So we need to understand, are there ways in which we can reduce the length of the MaxDiff exercise while still get the benefits of doing it? And this is largely because stakeholders are always pushing those boundaries of what we can test. Been in situations before where there's 40 different advertising messages, 50 benefit claims, 80 product names, 100 ideas for software features. And frankly, traditional MaxDiff or any other technique is going to struggle when these lists of this length are there, either meaning we need really large sample sizes or we need unfeasibly long exercises with too many tasks that take up too much time. Thankfully, we've got a couple of techniques that can account for this, and these are called Sparse and Express MaxDiff. And these can take the MaxDiff approach, but take less time, so we can get to the answer quicker with fewer respondents sometimes. Okay, so first we're going to start with Sparse MaxDiff. Now, Sparse MaxDiff works by reducing the exercise length because rather than asking people to see each item 3 times, which we normally would recommend with MaxDiff, we only get them to see each item once. For example, if we had 60 items and we showed 5 at a time, that would mean we'd need around 12 questions for a Sparse MaxDiff. For a traditional MaxDiff, this would require 36. So we've reduced the MaxDiff exercise to 33% of what it would have been otherwise. So this can save a lot of time in your design. However, we need to understand that there are some drawbacks to this. So in a traditional Sparse MaxDiff design, our design is what we like to call fully connected. So everyone sees every item 3 times in different contexts. That means that we know their A's relationship to E, to B, to C, to F, to D. We know how they all fit together, and we've got a really strong view on the relative preferences of those items. However, in a sparse design, each respondent has only seen every item once. So in this example, a respondent might have 2 tasks. They rate A to D and then E to H. And then the next respondent would have a slightly different task, and so on and so forth. However, these designs are not connected. So we see each item once and in a single context. And this lack of connection is important because we might know that a respondent in this exercise prefers A to C and they prefer G to F, but we don't know how these preferences overlap, if at all. And that's key because it means we can't create a reliable fit statistic for respondents. So what we mentioned before about being great at identifying bad respondents, we couldn't do that in a sparse MaxDiff design because we just don't know how reliable a respondent was when they went through several exercises. Because of this lack of connectivity, we need to treat each respondent as having a small piece of the solution to the puzzle. Therefore, sparse MaxDiff is great for aggregate level models, but can struggle to meaningfully differentiate respondent level scores. So perhaps running a single regression to produce one set of utilities might be the best thing to do, or you could still run latent class or even filter to run filtered aggregate models as well. But it's great at allowing us to have significantly shorter MaxDiff exercises. It works with really large lists where we still want everyone to see every item at least once, and it gives us robust aggregate level models. However, we don't get highly differentiated respondent level scores, and we don't get a reliable fit statistic for our model. So it does have some negative sides to saving that space in the questionnaire. On to Express MaxDiff. Express MaxDiff works by showing respondents a subset of items taken from a larger list. So, for example, we might have 50 items overall, but we just want to show respondents a random selection of 30. And because each respondent has that random subselection of 30 in this example, each respondent's individual study and task is going to be shorter than it would normally be. And we can use the information captured across other information to fill in any gaps we might have in their data. So let's take an example here. So we have a parent list of A to F. These are very short MaxDiff exercises, but it's just easier to explain for us. And we might have 3 blocks for our 3 respondents, where respondent 1 sees A, B, C, D, respondent 2 sees B, C, D, E, and respondent 3 sees A, C, E, F, for example. Now, what this means is we have missing data for each respondent in there. So we don't know for respondent 1 what their scores for E or F would be. We don't know for respondent 2 what A or F would be, or B or D for respondent 3. So we might do the MaxDiff exercise, and then we still need to fill in the gaps of where that data is. And just like Jurassic Park with frog DNA, we can use the information from the other respondents to guess where that information would be, meaning that we can recreate a full list of scores for every respondent there, meaning that our overall parent list information can be really robust. Now, again, the benefits of Express MaxDiff is it allows us to have much shorter tasks for respondents because we're only presenting with a subset. It allows for really good respondent level scores, albeit with some of them guessed by HB. And it means we can get a reliability of fit statistic for each respondent, so we know if they're a good respondent or not, which is key. However, because we're using HB to fill in the gaps of the scores, the respondent level scores could tend towards the population mean on some of the items that they didn't see. So therefore, perhaps using things like covariates in analysis can help preserve some of the differentiation across the key subgroups there. Now, the final use case, and I've boldened the word really here, is for when your attributes are really long. You've got a long list, it's not 30, it's not 40. You're probably talking a list in the hundreds here for this technique. And this technique is called Bandit MaxDiff. Now, it is a bit of a strange name, but it gets its name from a statistical probability theory where some low-paid statisticians were trying to understand how best to win money across different slot machines. And it works by using sampling of items in a list or slot machines to understand which ones are most likely to win, and therefore which ones do we want to prioritize in the future. So again, each respondent is going to be given a subset of the full list, and the sampled items which perform well will appear more often in future respondents' tasks. And this oversampling means we can get more precisions on items which are more likely to win, which Bandit is more likely to pay out, and therefore get robust results across winning items, even though our list is huge. So for example, let's assume we've got a list of 100 items and we're asking each respondent to rate 30 of them. The first 25 items which we populate each respondent's list will be taken from items which we know already that are performing well across previously completed respondents. Then we'll add 5 items in which we know aren't doing too well, but we want to give them a chance to either come into the well population or just to really understand the relative preference of those. And this means that as more respondents are completing these exercises, the lists they see will gradually become oversampled across the items which we know will perform well, so that we can be more confident about those items on the top of the list. So for example, if we have our parent list A to F again, we might have respondent 1 who does their task, and they give us a relative preference of A, C, B, D. When we go to respondent 15, for example, we'll oversample the winning item. So they still see A, B, C, but we add E into their list as well. And then for respondent 150, they still see A, B, C, but we might add F into their list as well. So you can see here that we oversample the winning items so that we get a really robust read on the ones that are doing well. And we still get a read on the ones that aren't doing quite as well, but nowhere near as strong as the top ones. So the benefit of using MaxDiff is that it uses information that's been collected already to oversample the winning items. This means that respondents are more likely to see those items which have the most appeal overall, giving us really good precision on those. And it gives us a greater confidence in using larger lists because we know that the best items are going to be rated robustly and not lost in, for example, a task where you're only showing every item once. However, Bandit assumes there's a single population for oversampling. So if you have segments in there that might have vastly different preferences, it's not going to work as well. So you might need to separate out your Bandit exercises for those people. And as items are oversampled, it requires the use of aggregate analysis because we're not getting enough respondent level data on each item in there to understand what the respondent level scores would be. So we need to use aggregate level respondents there. And because it focuses on identifying the best items, it means we have lower accuracy on the less preferred items that are there. So if you're just interested in the winners, it's sort of winner takes all mentality, then Bandit MaxDiff is great. But if you want to know really strong position at the bottom of the list, then it doesn't work quite as well for you there. So really, in conclusion, if you want to know which items are actually appealing for consumers, then you need to use anchored MaxDiff, as Brian greatly shared with us. If every item in your list isn't relevant to all of your respondents, then relevant item MaxDiff is the one for you. If you don't have the space for a long survey, particularly the MaxDiff exercise, then you can use either Sparse or Express MaxDiff, and it'll do a great job for you there. And if your list is really, really long, then Bandit MaxDiff is the one for you. Thank you very much. Okay, has anybody got any questions?
Yeah, we've had a number of questions here. We've answered some of them, but I think a couple are worth discussing. The one that I was just going to answer was from Howie. He said we should discuss kind of the middle zone in there, and the thought that I was going to write back is that we mentioned traditional MaxDiff. We typically say we want each item to show 3 times to our respondents. And Sparse that Dean covered is the other end of the spectrum where we just show each item once. And obviously, those aren't the only 2 options, right? So you can think of it as kind of a continuum, a spectrum, right? So the 3x showing each item 3 times is like, I'm saying I want good individual level data. Maybe I'm going to be doing some clustering or something like that. If I'm doing anchoring, I definitely want to show each item multiple times because I'm really worried about the individual level data. On the sparse side of things, you're saying I'm more interested in the aggregate. I'm intentionally sacrificing and saying I'm getting less information about the individuals in order to get through a really big list, for example, or something like that. So absolutely, there's a spectrum there. If you only show each item twice, you're going to be kind of in the middle there. We don't necessarily have a great resource on like 3x, 2.5x, 2x, 1.5x. It's more of a continuum there where you design the project based on what you think is the most important goal. So it's a good point to bring up. You don't have to do the gold standard or sparse. There is space in between those as well.
As a consultant, I would regularly go 2x, just because it gets my questionnaire size down, but it also means I can be a bit more confident in the results. So yeah, I would go 2x a lot of the time, but yeah, try and do 3 whenever possible.
Yeah, and another consideration might be if you're going to be doing that, identifying random people. You can't do that if you do a sparse because people don't have any opportunity to provide conflicting information because they only see each item once. So if you're trying to identify random folks, you would want to go to this end of the spectrum, make sure you're showing things probably the 3 times so that we get a better fit statistic that we can use to identify folks. Some of the other questions were asking things like, is there a best or how many? Those type of things. We do have a lot of white papers. So Sawtooth runs a conference each year where people come and present research. And these type of questions are a lot of the things that people talk about, like how many questions and what type of sample size do I need for a bandit? And so a lot of times we have white papers on the website. So we're probably not going to be able to get to all of these questions, but we'll chat around more. But we'll be sending white papers links for a lot of these as well that are free on our website.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Dean. Another question I think that'd be good to address live is the difference between Bandit MaxDiff and adaptive conjoint, and how do those two kind of act similarly but are different?
Yeah, I can take that one. So Bandit, this is the kind of the fun thing. So you got to have names for approaches so that they are memorable and we don't trademark them, but we try to come up with things so that it's something that you can write about and people can start saying and referring to. So the name Bandit is a type of adaptive design. So we mentioned at the very beginning, traditional MaxDiff approaches, you got 30 items. We're going to take 5 at a time. We're going to do that in a way so that everything is balanced. We show every item an equal number of times and against and in the positions and everything from like a statistical perspective is as good as it can be. Adaptivity could mean a lot of different things. There are ways, we have a white paper, it's not built into the software, but doing an adaptive design within a respondent where your first few MaxDiff questions do nice and are balanced like a traditional approach, and then you oversample the ones who won who were best, and you undersample the worst, but you do that within a respondent. Whereas Bandit, it would be confusing to call that another type of adaptive. So Bandit is adaptive across respondents. We oversample stuff that from previous respondents has been chosen as best, and we undersample things that are chosen as worst. So they're a different type of adaptivity, but it's the same idea. We're adjusting how we choose what people see in their questions. There are methods of adaptive conjoint that are typically the within respondent approach. So adaptive choice-based conjoint, for example, asks a respondent to configure their own ideal product and then uses that as a design seed to try to oversample the levels that the person likes. We still show the other levels, but we do some oversampling. So it's kind of it's a similar idea. We're trying to use a data point to build more relevant questions for the respondent. So similar idea, but the type of adaptiveness varies method to method.
Great. Thank you. I think a lot of these questions are individualized, so I think we can stay on longer to answer those. I do want to mention, because this has come up in the questions, that for more of these advanced MaxDiff options are only currently available in Lighthouse Studio. So you will need a Lighthouse Studio subscription to be able to do those at this time.
I'd just like to point out as well, if anybody wanted programming examples or a demo version of Lighthouse or Discover to try, or just wanted to find out more information, really, you could email me, dean@sawtoothsoftware.com, or our support teams in the US and the UK. So we've got lots of resources. We're more than willing to help you out, learn how to do these techniques, because I'm sure you've all run into these issues that we've outlined today, and hopefully there'll be really useful solutions for you all. Thank you.